Poor 85-year-old man is wrongfully accused of stealing at a grocery store, but when his identity is revealed, the whole store is in shock. Mr. Harold Harris entered the grocery store with a slow, careful step. The early autumn chill had seeped into his bones, and his worn-out jacket did little to shield him from the cold. His frail frame seemed even smaller inside the oversized coat, which had seen better days decades ago. The fabric was thin, patched in several places, and the sleeves hung loosely around his wrists. He clutched the jacket tightly as he shuffled forward, his gaze fixed downward, avoiding eye contact with the people around him. The store was bustling with the usual afternoon crowd, mothers pushing carts filled with groceries, teenagers loitering by the snack aisle, and employees stocking shelves. But none of them noticed Mr. Harris. He moved silently among the aisles, picking up only what he needed, a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk. His fingers, frail and trembling, struggled to hold the basket steady as he walked toward the checkout. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders, visible in the slight hunch of his back and the slow, deliberate way he moved. From across the store, Lisa, the store manager, noticed him. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s, always on alert for any trouble. Her gaze narrowed as she observed Mr. Harris in his tattered clothes. "Dan," she whispered to the security guard standing beside her. "You see that old guy over there?" Dan, a bulky man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, followed her line of sight. He noticed Mr. Harris's disheveled appearance and nodded. "Yeah, I see him," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Something about Mr. Harris immediately bothered Lisa. She had worked at the grocery store for years and had seen her share of shoplifters, people who didn't quite fit the mold of the typical customer. And to her, Mr. Harris looked like trouble. The way his clothes were worn, the unsteady way he moved, the cautious glances he cast as he walked. Everything about him seemed off. Without a second thought, Lisa made up her mind. This man, she was certain, was up to no good. As Mr. Harris reached the register, he carefully placed the bread and milk on the counter. His hands fumbled in his pockets as he tried to pull out the few crumpled bills he had. The cashier barely looked at him, uninterested in the quiet old man standing before her. But before Mr. Harris could hand over his money, Dan stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shadow over the counter. "Sir," Dan said, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of nearby shoppers. "I need to check your pockets. We've had reports of theft." Mr. Harris looked up, confusion clouding his tired eyes. What?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His thin fingers, still clutching his money, trembled as he looked from Dan to the cashier and back again. Lisa walked over, arms crossed, her face stern. "We've been watching you," she said coldly. "You look suspicious, and we don't take chances with people like you in this store." Mr. Harris blinked, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "I haven't done anything wrong," he finally managed to say, his voice shaking. He raised his hand slightly, showing the few bills he had pulled from his pocket. "I'm just here to buy bread and milk." But Lisa wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind, and now, with Dan by her side, she was determined to follow through. "Empty your pockets," she demanded, her tone harsh. Mr. Harris stood frozen, stunned by the sudden accusation. The quiet dignity that had always defined him seemed to falter under the weight of their scrutiny. He slowly shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please," he said softly. "I've done nothing wrong." Dan stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "Do what she says, old man. We don't have time for this." By now, a few customers had started to gather nearby, curious about the scene unfolding at the front of the store. They whispered among themselves, exchanging glances as they watched Mr. Harris being confronted by the staff. Some looked on with suspicion, others with pity, but none of them intervened. Mr. Harris's hands trembled as he stood there, the small basket still hanging from his frail arm. His breath came in short, uneven bursts as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being accused. And for what? He didn't understand how things had escalated so quickly, why these people were treating him as though he had done something terrible. His heart ached with a mixture of confusion and humiliation, and all he wanted was to leave, to disappear from this awful moment. But Lisa and Dan weren't finished with him yet. The situation escalated far too quickly for Mr. Harris to understand. Before he could collect his thoughts or offer any further explanation, Lisa and Dan had already made up their minds. The scene around him grew more tense as shoppers slowed their carts to watch, some whispering to each other, others simply observing in silence. Mr. Harris, still bewildered, stood frozen at the counter, his hands trembling as he clutched his basket. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the way their gazes seemed to press down on him, making him feel smaller and more vulnerable than ever. Lisa's voice cut through the quiet chatter like a knife. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior in our store," she said, her tone sharp and accusing. "If you've taken something, now's your chance to admit it. But don't think we're going to let you walk out of here without checking your things." Mr. Harris blinked, the words not quite registering at first. His mind was still reeling from the shock of being confronted so publicly, and it felt like the world around him was moving too fast for him to keep up. I didn't steal anything," he said softly, his voice barely audible. He tried to look Lisa in the eyes, but her expression remained cold, unmoved by his quiet plea. Dan, towering beside him, stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Without asking, he grabbed the small basket from Mr. Harris's hand. The loaf of bread and carton of milk tumbled out, landing on the floor with a dull thud. The sound seemed to echo in the heavy silence that followed. Mr. Harris's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as he watched the simple items spill out onto the tiled floor. "See?" Lisa said, gesturing toward the scattered groceries. "You're making a scene. Just empty your pockets and we'll sort this out." Mr. Harris's hands instinctively went to his pockets, but he hesitated. He felt humiliated, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in their eyes, despite the fact that he had done nothing wrong. His head hung low as he muttered, "There's nothing in my pockets, just my money for the bread and milk." Lisa crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. "If you've got nothing to hide, then prove it. We don't have all day." By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn in by the tension and the raised voices. Some shoppers whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of the situation. Others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. A mother pulled her child closer to her, casting a wary glance at Mr. Harris. A group of teenagers nearby snickered, clearly amused by the unfolding drama, but no one stepped forward to help or speak up for the old man. "I don't understand," Mr. Harris said, his voice cracking slightly. "Why are you doing this to me?" Lisa, already convinced of his guilt, shook her head. "We've had issues with people like you before. If you're not going to cooperate, you can leave. We don't need troublemakers in our store." Dan's grip on Mr. Harris's arm tightened slightly as he took a step forward, guiding him toward the exit. "Come on, let's go," Dan muttered, his voice gruff but not unkind. It was clear that he, too, had made his judgment about the old man, though his actions were more about following Lisa's lead than any real malice. Mr. Harris stumbled slightly as Dan urged him forward, his body feeling weaker under the weight of the moment. He looked around, hoping someone, anyone, might intervene, might see the truth of what was happening. But the faces in the crowd remained passive, indifferent. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. "Wait, I didn't do anything wrong," Mr. Harris protested, though his voice was shaky and uncertain. But it was too late. Lisa was already shaking her head, signaling to Dan that there was no point in continuing the discussion. "We've seen enough," Lisa said with finality. "Just leave. And don't come back." Dan escorted Mr. Harris to the front door, the crowd parting to let them pass. A few of the onlookers exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, others simply curious. Mr. Harris's head hung low, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and shame. He couldn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly, how he had gone from quietly buying groceries to being pushed out of the store as if he were some kind of criminal. As the automatic doors slid open, Dan released his grip on Mr. Harris's arm. "You're banned from this store," Lisa called out after him, her voice firm and unyielding. "Don't come back." Mr. Harris stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face once more. His heart felt heavy as he stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before he could process the moment, the doors slid shut behind him, cutting him off from the warmth and light of the store. Unbeknownst to Mr. Harris, a quiet observer had been watching the entire scene unfold from the back of the store. Sarah Collins, a local reporter, stood near the dairy aisle, her sharp eyes following every movement. She had come to the grocery store that afternoon on a completely unrelated assignment, something about rising food prices and how they were affecting the local community. But as soon as she saw the commotion at the checkout, her instincts as a journalist kicked in. Sarah's attention had been drawn to the frail old man the moment she noticed the store staff eyeing him. There was something unsettling about the way they treated him, almost as if his appearance alone was enough to raise suspicion. She watched as he carefully selected his groceries, his movements slow and deliberate. The way he handled the bread and milk told her he had likely done this routine 1,000 times before, each action measured by the modest means at his disposal. But then the accusations began, and Sarah's stomach tightened. She wasn't expecting to witness anything more than an ordinary trip to the store, but now the situation was unraveling into something else entirely. She saw how the security guard had approached the old man, how the manager had spoken to him with little patience or kindness. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, could sense the crowd's growing interest in the confrontation. And through it all, Mr. Harris had stood there, confused, humiliated, and clearly not understanding why this was happening to him. Instinctively, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She didn't want to miss a single detail, not for a moment. Though she wasn't sure what was happening or who the man was, something about the scene didn't sit right with her. Her gut told her this was more than just an ordinary misunderstanding. It felt like the beginning of something much larger. With a quick tap, she began recording. The camera captured everything. The old man's soft protests, the impatient remarks from the manager, and the way the crowd stood by, watching in silence. Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and disbelief as she continued to record. Was no one going to say anything? Was no one going to step in? She knew better than to intervene directly, knowing it could compromise her role as a reporter, but the urge to do so gnawed at her. When the guard, Dan, finally escorted Mr. Harris toward the exit, Sarah couldn't stop herself from following, her phone still in hand. From a distance, she watched as the automatic doors slid shut behind the elderly man, cutting him off from the world inside the store. Her heart ached as she imagined what he must be feeling: confusion, frustration, shame. No one should be treated like that, especially someone so vulnerable. As the crowd began to disperse and the store returned to its usual rhythm, Sarah pocketed her phone and made her way toward the exit, her mind racing. She hadn't planned on covering this type of story, but there was no doubt in her mind now. Something about this encounter deserved attention. Who was this old man? Why had he been treated so harshly? And more importantly, why did no one else seem to care? Later that night, as she sat in front of her computer, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harris's face. There was a quiet dignity about him, despite the humiliating way he had been treated. Something about his demeanor stood out, as though he had once been someone of great importance or respect, now reduced to this moment of public scorn. She had seen plenty of people down on their luck during her career, but Mr. Harris seemed different. It was as if he carried the weight of something bigger, something deeper than just his disheveled appearance. With her fingers hovering over the keyboard, Sarah made a decision. She would start by finding out who Mr. Harris was. The details of the story were unclear, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. She reviewed the footage she had captured on her phone, pausing on a close-up of his face. It was worn, etched with years of experience, and yet there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet strength beneath the surface. As Sarah began her research, combing through public records and local archives, she couldn't help but wonder, what was the story behind this man, and why had no one recognized him? Something told her that the answers to those questions would lead to a story far bigger than she could have anticipated. And so, with renewed determination, she set to work, knowing that uncovering the truth behind Mr. Harris was just the beginning. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the computer screen, the hum of the city outside her apartment barely registering in her mind. She had spent hours digging through local archives, old news articles, and any public records she could find. Her mind buzzed with anticipation as she pieced together fragments of Mr. Harris's life. The deeper she went, the clearer the picture became, and when she finally stumbled upon the key piece of information, she gasped, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. The man she had seen thrown out of the grocery store wasn't just any elderly man. He was Harold Harris, the very founder of the grocery chain where he had been humiliated. She leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding as she processed the significance of what she had uncovered. Mr. Harris wasn't just a vulnerable old man. He had once been a highly respected businessman, a philanthropist even, known for his contributions to the community. Sarah stared at the old photos she had found in an online archive. It was a grainy black and white picture from decades ago, but the resemblance was undeniable. There he was, much younger, standing proudly in front of what was then the first store in what would eventually become a successful chain of grocery stores. His smile was bright, his posture confident, and beside him stood a woman, most likely his wife, beaming with pride. Sarah's mind raced as she pulled up more articles. Harold Harris had been known for his charitable efforts, often giving back to the community that had supported his business. He had established his grocery chain with a mission to help low-income families, ensuring they had access to affordable food. His name had once been synonymous with generosity and integrity. But what had happened? How had this man, who had clearly been a prominent figure, ended up in such a state of obscurity? Digging further, Sarah uncovered the answer. After his wife's death nearly a decade ago, Mr. Harris had gradually retreated from public life. His health had declined, and with no children or close family to support him, he had quietly faded from the public eye. As the years went on, his wealth had dwindled, much of it given away to various charities. The grocery chain he had built had since passed through corporate hands, becoming a much larger enterprise that bore little resemblance to its original community-focused roots. Sarah felt a pang of sadness as she read the details. This man, who had once been celebrated for his success and kindness, was now living in near poverty, struggling to afford the very necessities his stores had once provided to others. His story was heartbreaking, one of loss, decline, and the cruel indifference of time. But what struck Sarah the most was how easily he had been forgotten. How could a man like Harold Harris, with such an impactful legacy, become invisible in the eyes of the very community he had once served? Her thoughts shifted back to the incident at the grocery store. The way Lisa and Dan had treated him, they had no idea who he was. They had seen only an old man in tattered clothes, not the person who had once built their business from the ground up. The irony was staggering. The store, a part of the very chain that Mr. Harris had founded, had cast him out without a second thought, treating him like a criminal simply because of his appearance. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she began outlining her article. This wasn't just a story about wrongful accusations or poor treatment of the elderly. This was about something bigger, about how society often overlooks the most vulnerable, about the danger of forgetting the contributions of those who came before. Mr. Harris's story needed to be told, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call for change. As she wrote, Sarah felt a growing sense of responsibility. She knew that this story could have a real impact, that it could shine a light on the injustices faced by people like Mr. Harris every day, and she was determined to tell it with care, ensuring that his legacy was restored, not just for him, but for the community that had unknowingly turned its back on one of its own. The more Sarah wrote, the more personal the story became. She had seen the cruelty of assumptions, the way people judged others based on nothing more than appearances. But Mr. Harris wasn't just a victim. He was a reminder that everyone has a story, a history, and that kindness should never be withheld because of how someone looks or what they might seem to represent. With the final lines of her article typed out, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind still buzzing with the weight of what she had uncovered. This was no longer just an investigative piece. It was a story about redemption, about recognizing the humanity in those who are often overlooked. And she knew that once it was published, it would make waves. Sarah's fingers hovered over the publish button, her mind racing with the implications of the story she had just written. It was one of those pieces that practically wrote itself, every detail, every fact aligning perfectly into a narrative that was both shocking and heartbreaking. But more than that, it was a call to action, a demand for accountability. She had uncovered the tragic story of a man who had once given everything to his community, only to be discarded and humiliated in his old age. Still, she hesitated for a moment, her thoughts lingering on Mr. Harris's past. As she dug deeper into his life, Sarah had uncovered not just the facts of his business success, but the personal tragedies that had shaped him. His wife, Eleanor, had been the love of his life, and her death had left a void he never fully recovered from. The loss had been a slow unraveling for him. After years of building his grocery chain and donating much of his wealth to help others, he had found himself alone without the support network he once relied on. But even as his health failed and his fortune diminished, Mr. Harris had never asked for anything. He had lived quietly, relying on his small pension, careful with every dollar. It was almost as though he had become invisible to the world, his identity as a successful businessman and philanthropist completely erased by the passing of time. That day in the grocery store was just another reminder of how far he had fallen. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harris standing there, confused and humiliated as the security guard and manager had accused him. They didn't know who he was, of course, but that was part of the problem. No one had recognized him, not the staff, not the customers, not even the community he had once served. His face had become just another anonymous one in the crowd. It was then that Sarah realized just how important this story was. This wasn't just about exposing a mistake made by a few people in a grocery store. It was about the way society treated its elders, about how quickly we forgot those who had paved the way for us. Mr. Harris's story was one of many, a symbol of how easily people could be overlooked, misjudged, or cast aside. Determined, Sarah pressed publish and watched as the article went live on the local news website. She had written it carefully, starting with a recounting of the incident she had witnessed, then peeling back the layers of Mr. Harris's life. She included his history, the founding of the grocery chain, his years of charitable work, and the slow decline that led to his current situation. She was clear about the injustice of what had happened, but her tone remained calm and professional, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. As soon as the article was published, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. Readers were already reacting, sharing the story on social media, and leaving comments that ranged from disbelief to outrage. The story began to spread quickly, shared across platforms by people who were shocked by the injustice and moved by the deeper message of the piece. Within hours, the article had been picked up by larger news outlets, each one emphasizing the heartbreaking irony of Mr. Harris's situation. As she watched the story take on a life of its own, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She was proud, of course, proud that she had uncovered such an important story and told it with the care it deserved. But she also felt a deep sadness for Mr. Harris. He hadn't asked for any of this attention. He hadn't sought out justice or recognition. He had simply tried to live his life, and now the world was learning the painful truth about how he had been treated. By the end of the day, Sarah's inbox was flooded with messages, some from readers thanking her for telling Mr. Harris's story, others from news organizations asking for interviews. But the most important email came from the corporate office of the grocery chain itself. The tone was formal and apologetic. The company's leadership was clearly panicking, realizing the gravity of what had happened in one of their stores. They promised an internal investigation and mentioned the possibility of a public apology to Mr. Harris. Sarah felt a small sense of relief, knowing that her story was already making a difference. Still, as she closed her laptop for the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but what came next would be just as important. Mr. Harris deserved more than just an apology. He deserved to be remembered for the man he once was, not just for the humiliating moment that had brought him back into the public eye. And with that, Sarah knew her job wasn't done yet. The story of Harold Harris still had more chapters to be written. The morning after Sarah published the article, her phone buzzed incessantly. The story had gained traction much faster than she anticipated, going viral within hours. Her inbox was flooded with messages from readers expressing a range of emotions: anger, sadness, and most of all, disbelief. The headline had done its job, grabbing attention, but it was the content that kept people talking. The image of an elderly man, once a respected figure in the community, being treated so poorly by a store he had founded, struck a chord with everyone who read the piece. Social media erupted in outrage. People shared the article, adding their own thoughts and stories about how they had witnessed or experienced similar injustices. It wasn't just about Mr. Harris anymore. It was about how society treated its most vulnerable. The comments were filled with calls for accountability, with many demanding that the grocery chain take immediate action to right this wrong. Within a few hours, national news outlets had picked up the story. Major publications ran their own pieces, quoting Sarah's article and providing updates as the story developed. The hashtag number Justice for Harris began trending, with thousands of people sharing the article and tagging the grocery chain's official accounts. Calls for a boycott echoed across social media, with people vowing not to shop at the store until Mr. Harris received a public apology. At the grocery chain's corporate headquarters, the reaction was swift and panicked. Executives scrambled to contain the damage, knowing that the longer they stayed silent, the worse the backlash would become. The CEO was furious, demanding immediate answers from the store in question. How could something like this happen? And how had no one recognized the man who had once been a pillar of their business? Emails flew back and forth between corporate executives and the local store's management. Lisa, the manager, was bombarded with questions from her superiors. She tried to downplay the situation, insisting that the store had followed standard procedure when dealing with suspected theft. But it quickly became clear that her handling of the incident was indefensible, especially now that the truth about Mr. Harris had come to light. Dan, the security guard, found himself in an equally uncomfortable position. While he had simply been following Lisa's lead, his involvement in the incident made him a central figure in the public outcry. Both he and Lisa had become the faces of the scandal, their names and actions plastered across social media and news reports. As the pressure mounted, the grocery chain's corporate office issued a brief statement, promising a thorough internal investigation into the incident. But the public wasn't satisfied with vague promises. People wanted to see real action, and they wanted it fast. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the corporate office knew that something more concrete was needed to calm the outrage. Meanwhile, Sarah watched the story unfold with a mix of pride and trepidation. She hadn't expected it to gain such widespread attention, but now that it had, she knew that Mr. Harris's story was making a real impact. The article had started an important conversation about how society treats the elderly and those who are less fortunate. But she also worried about Mr. Harris himself. How was he coping with all this sudden attention? Had anyone reached out to him yet? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a local news station requesting an interview. They wanted to talk to her about the article, about how she had uncovered the story, and what she thought should happen next. Sarah hesitated. She had never been one to seek the spotlight herself. The focus in her mind should always be on the story, not the journalist behind it. But this was bigger than just a news piece now. It had become a movement, and if her voice could help push for change, she knew she had to step up. Before agreeing to the interview, Sarah made a point to reach out to Mr. Harris. She had managed to track down a phone number for him during her initial research and wanted to make sure he was okay before any further media coverage descended upon him. After a few rings, a frail but steady voice answered. "Mr. Harris?" Sarah said gently, unsure of how he would react to everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. "It's Sarah Collins. I'm the reporter who wrote the article about what happened to you at the grocery store." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, Sarah worried that she had overwhelmed him, but then Mr. Harris responded. "I saw it," he said quietly. "I didn't expect any of this." Sarah smiled softly. "I didn't either, but people are paying attention now. They want to make things right. I just wanted to check on you. Are you holding up okay?" Mr. Harris sighed, and there was a hint of weariness in his voice. "I suppose I'll manage, but I don't need all this fuss. I've lived my life. I don't need apologies from people who don't even know me anymore." Sarah's heart sank at his words, but she understood. For him, this wasn't about public recognition or justice. It was about dignity. And as the story continued to grow, Sarah vowed to ensure that Mr. Harris's dignity remained at the center of it all. The next few days were a whirlwind for the grocery chain's corporate office. Public pressure mounted with every passing hour, and the story showed no signs of slowing down. The hashtag number Justice for Harris was still trending, and customers had begun organizing small protests outside several of the chain's locations. Boycotts had started to affect sales, and it was clear that the company had to act fast if it wanted to contain the damage. A team of corporate investigators was dispatched to the store where the incident had occurred. Their task was simple: gather all the facts, interview the staff involved, and figure out how such a gross mishandling of the situation had taken place. Lisa, the store manager, was the first to be questioned. She tried to maintain her composure as the investigators sat down in the back office, but the weight of the situation was starting to crack her usual confidence. "I was just doing my job," she insisted, her voice tense as she fidgeted with a pen. "We've had issues with shoplifting before, and I thought it was best to be cautious." The investigators exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. "Did you know who Mr. Harris was at the time?" one of them asked, leaning forward. Lisa's face flushed slightly. "No, I mean, how could I have known? He didn't exactly look like the founder of the company." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Lisa immediately regretted saying them. It wasn't just her tone, it was the way she had reduced Mr. Harris to his appearance, the very thing that had sparked this entire controversy. The investigators took note but said nothing more on the matter. Next, Dan, the security guard, was called in. He wasn't as defensive as Lisa, but seemed more uneasy, shifting in his seat as he recalled the events of that day. "I just followed orders," he said quietly. "Lisa told me to check his pockets, and I did. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The investigators pressed him on the details, asking whether he had any reason to believe Mr. Harris had stolen something. Dan shook his head. "No, not really. It was just, the way he looked. I should have asked more questions." That admission hung heavy in the room. It was clear now that the incident had been based on little more than assumptions and snap judgments, fueled by the biases that Lisa and Dan hadn't even realized they held. The corporate investigators wrapped up the interviews and began reviewing store policies, quickly identifying a disturbing trend. This wasn't the first time customers who appeared poor or elderly had been treated unfairly. The investigation revealed multiple instances in which individuals had been closely watched or accused of theft without clear evidence, simply because they didn't fit the typical profile of the store's usual clientele. It was a pattern of behavior that went against the very values the chain had been founded on, values that Harold Harris himself had built the company around decades ago. As the investigators compiled their findings, it became clear that drastic measures needed to be taken to restore the store's reputation. Meanwhile, back at corporate headquarters, the leadership team scrambled to draft an official statement. They knew that words alone wouldn't be enough this time. The public was demanding accountability. And so, after much deliberation, a decision was made. Lisa and Dan would be let go, and the store would issue a public apology to Mr. Harris. The company hoped this would begin to mend the damage done, but they also realized that something more profound had to come from this incident. It wasn't just about damage control, it was about righting a wrong and ensuring it never happened again. When the news broke that both Lisa and Dan had been fired, reactions were mixed. Some people felt it was the right thing to do, that they needed to be held responsible for their actions. Others questioned whether firing them was enough, or if the problem went deeper. But regardless of the public's opinion, the message was clear. The grocery chain knew it had to change. Shortly after, the company announced plans to host a public event where they would apologize to Mr. Harris in person. They extended an invitation to him, offering him the position of guest of honor at the event, where they would formally recognize his contributions to the company and the community. The corporate office hoped this gesture would help repair the damage, but they also knew it wouldn't be easy. Mr. Harris had every right to refuse, to turn his back on the company that had failed him. Word of the event spread quickly, and soon the entire community was buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just a corporate apology, it was becoming a public moment of reckoning. The grocery chain wanted to make amends, but it was up to Mr. Harris to decide whether or not he would accept. As the date of the event drew closer, all eyes were on Mr. Harris. How would he respond? Would he accept the apology? And more importantly, would this event lead to real change? Or would it be just another corporate gesture meant to smooth over the cracks? The community, the company, and even Sarah were left waiting, unsure of what would happen next. When the invitation from the grocery chain's corporate office arrived at Mr. Harris's small apartment, he wasn't sure how to feel. It was a formal letter, written in carefully chosen words, expressing deep regret for what had happened to him in the store and asking him to attend a public event where the company would apologize. Mr. Harris read the letter twice, trying to make sense of it. They were offering him the position of guest of honor, promising to recognize his contributions to the company's founding and the community. But after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure he wanted the attention. For years, Mr. Harris had lived a quiet life, far removed from the spotlight. The world he once knew had changed so much, and he had no desire to be at the center of some grand, public gesture. He didn't need apologies or ceremonies. But as he sat in his worn armchair, thinking back on that day in the store, a new thought took root in his mind. This wasn't just about him anymore. What had happened in that store was about something bigger, about how society treated the elderly, the poor, and the forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, this event could be an opportunity to do more than just accept an apology. With that thought, Mr. Harris made up his mind. He would attend the event, but not to receive personal recognition or fanfare. If he was going to go, it would be for a purpose, to speak about the larger issue at hand and ensure that the company's promises weren't just empty words. He sat down at his small kitchen table, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to jot down a few thoughts. His handwriting was shaky and slow, but his words were clear. When the corporate office received Mr. Harris's response, they were relieved. The CEO personally called him, thanking him for agreeing to attend the event and assuring him that they wanted to make things right. Mr. Harris listened politely, but his thoughts were focused on what he wanted to say. He had one request, that the store commit to more than just an apology. He wanted to see a long-term initiative to help those who were struggling, the same people his stores had originally been designed to serve. The company's leadership quickly agreed, seeing this as an opportunity to turn the negative press into something positive. Plans were set in motion for the event, and the corporate team began working with local charities to develop a new initiative in Mr. Harris's name. They called it the Harris Initiative, a program that would provide groceries and other essential items to elderly and low-income families at reduced or no cost. It was the perfect way to honor Mr. Harris's legacy while addressing the very issues that had led to the incident in the first place. As the day of the event approached, word spread throughout the community. People who had read Sarah's article or seen the story on the news were eager to attend. It wasn't just about witnessing a corporate apology. It was about seeing something meaningful come out of the situation. There was a buzz in the air, with many wondering what Mr. Harris would say. After all, he had been silent since the story broke, and everyone was curious about how he felt about all the attention. Sarah, too, prepared for the event with a mix of anticipation and curiosity. She had followed up on the story with a few more articles, highlighting the community's reaction and the changes the grocery chain had promised. But she hadn't spoken directly with Mr. Harris since their brief phone call, and she wondered how he was handling everything. She knew that he wasn't one for the spotlight, but there was a quiet strength in him that made her believe he had something important to say. On the morning of the event, the store was transformed. A stage had been set up outside, surrounded by rows of chairs for the attendees. There were banners with the store's logo, but also signs promoting the new Harris Initiative. The crowd began to gather early, and soon the parking lot was filled with people, customers, local officials, media, and members of the community who had been touched by Mr. Harris's story. Mr. Harris arrived quietly, dressed in a simple but dignified suit. As he walked through the crowd, there were murmurs of recognition, but he kept his head down, not seeking attention. The corporate team greeted him warmly, expressing their gratitude for his presence. The CEO gave a short speech, formally apologizing on behalf of the company, acknowledging the mistakes that had been made, and introducing the Harris Initiative as a way to ensure something positive came out of the ordeal. But it was Mr. Harris's speech that everyone was waiting for. When he finally stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. He took a moment to collect his thoughts, looking out at the sea of faces before him. This was not where he had imagined his life would lead, but here he was, standing before his community once again. "I didn't come here today for recognition," he began, his voice steady but soft. "And I didn't come here to dwell on what happened to me. I came here because there are people in this community who need help. People who, like me, may have been forgotten or overlooked." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We judge too quickly, often by appearances. But the truth is, everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves dignity. And it's up to us, each one of us, to ensure that we treat others the way we would want to be treated." The crowd listened intently, moved by his humility and sincerity. Mr. Harris spoke not just for himself, but for all those who were often unseen. And by the time he finished, the message was clear. This was more than just an apology. It was a call for real, lasting change. As Mr. Harris finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't the thunderous, hollow kind of clapping that follows a typical corporate event. Instead, it was the heartfelt response of people moved by his words. Many had come expecting to witness a simple apology, but what they received was something far deeper, a call for empathy, for compassion, and for change in how society treated its most vulnerable members. Mr. Harris stepped back from the microphone, his face calm but tired. This moment had taken a lot out of him, but it had also given him something in return, a sense of purpose. He had spent years in quiet isolation, watching the world move on without him. But now he had spoken up, not just for himself, but for all those who had been overlooked and mistreated. It felt like a small victory, not just for him, but for the community he had always cared about. The CEO of the grocery chain returned to the stage, visibly moved by Mr. Harris's words. She gave him a respectful nod before addressing the audience again. "We hear you, Mr. Harris, and we hear this community. Today is not just about making things right. It's about ensuring that we never let this happen again. She gestured to a large banner behind her, revealing the official launch of the Harris Initiative. The program, as the CEO explained, would provide ongoing support for elderly and low-income customers, offering discounted groceries, free delivery services for those unable to leave their homes, and partnerships with local charities to help distribute food to those in need. The announcement was met with enthusiasm, and there were murmurs of approval from the crowd. It was clear that this initiative had struck a chord, and many saw it as a genuine attempt to rectify the mistakes that had been made. For the company, it was a necessary step toward rebuilding trust. For the community, it was a much-needed acknowledgement that change was possible, that even in large corporations, there could be room for compassion and understanding. As the event came to a close, Mr. Harris quietly mingled with a few people who came up to shake his hand, thank him, or simply offer kind words. Sarah, who had been watching from the sidelines, felt a swell of pride for the man she had come to know through her reporting. She approached him, her phone and notebook tucked away. This wasn't a moment for journalism. It was a moment for humanity. "Mr. Harris," she said softly as she reached him, "that was an incredible speech. Thank you for everything you've done. I think you've made a real difference today." He looked at her, his eyes tired but kind. "I just hope it does some good," he replied, his voice modest. "This world has changed so much, but people still need each other. We forget that sometimes." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. His story had brought out the best in many people, but it was also a reminder of how far society had to go. "You've reminded a lot of people of that today," she said. "I think things are going to be different now." Mr. Harris gave her a small, grateful smile. "I hope so. Not for me, but for those who need it." As the crowd began to disperse, the atmosphere remained hopeful. People left not just with the memory of an apology, but with the knowledge that they could be part of something better, something kinder. And for Mr. Harris, as he quietly left the event, there was a sense of peace. He hadn't asked for this attention, but he had found a way to use it for good. His legacy, once nearly forgotten, had now become a symbol of change and compassion. The event had passed, but its impact rippled through the community and beyond. In the days that followed, the grocery chain wasted no time in rolling out the Harris Initiative, a program that quickly became a model for other businesses in the region. Stores across the chain began offering discounts to the elderly, providing free delivery to those who couldn't easily leave their homes, and working closely with local charities to ensure no one went hungry. It wasn't just a corporate gesture anymore, it was a movement. Mr. Harris, though reluctant to take credit, had become a symbol of resilience and compassion. His story had touched thousands of lives, from customers who now saw him as a local hero, to business leaders who realized that change was not only necessary but possible. His name, once forgotten by the company he had built, now stood for something much greater, a reminder of the power of kindness and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, no matter their appearance or circumstances. As for Mr. Harris himself, he returned to his quiet life, content with the knowledge that his legacy had been restored, not in terms of wealth or fame, but in the impact he had made on the community. He continued to shop at the grocery store, though the staff now greeted him with a warm smile and a genuine sense of respect. There was no need for special treatment. Mr. Harris was simply glad to see that the world had become a little kinder, thanks in part to his story. Sarah Collins, the reporter who had uncovered the truth, received widespread praise for her work. Her articles had not only brought attention to Mr. Harris's situation, but had sparked conversations about how society treated its most vulnerable. She continued to write, focusing on stories that mattered, stories that could make a real difference in people's lives. And though she and Mr. Harris only spoke occasionally after the event, there was a quiet understanding between them. Their shared goal had been achieved. In the end, Mr. Harris's life wasn't defined by the wealth he once had or the hardships he had faced in his later years. Instead, he was remembered for his kindness, his humility, and his willingness to use a painful moment to help others. The grocery chain had redeemed itself, and the community had learned an important lesson. No one should be judged by their outward appearance, and everyone, no matter how small or quiet their presence, had a story worth listening to. Mr. Harris had found peace, and with that, the story came to a close, leaving behind a legacy of compassion that would last for years to come. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.